Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Transform Finance Investor Network webinar, Building a Energy Structure for Just Transition for Native Communities. Today we have Anair Ben-Ami of Candide Group, Transform Finance Investor Network member, who's going to be doing a bit of a framing on what we mean by just transition and investing in energy infrastructure. And then we're going to hear from a super interesting project, Navajo Power. We have Dan Rosen and Brett Isaac on the line, who are going to be talking a bit about their work building renewable energy projects and centering the roles and voices of Indigenous communities. Just before we get started, I have a few updates from Transform Finance. We have an exciting new project that we're kicking off. It's a field scan of grassroots approaches to capital stewardship, wealth building, and equity more broadly, talking about ways communities can get involved with capital and development that really center the voices of communities and are building kind of alternative models that can be scaled with the help of philanthropy and financial intermediaries. And for this project, we have several research opportunities, including a full-time research manager position. So if that sounds like something that you or someone you know might be interested in chipping in on, we'd be happy to have a conversation around research support. Another really exciting program that we have launching this spring is a cohort of social justice organizations who are developing capital approaches to their organizing work. And thematically, the theme is around the future of workers. So looking for organizations who are trying to engage with the finance space in a really deep and organized campaign for the benefits of workers. And kind of piggybacking off of our prior work looking at the role of the shareholder and in capital in providing workers quality jobs and protections in the face of a changing landscape of labor. For the Investor Network, just as a insight into what's coming next, we have a webinar with Accountability Council in early March on the 12th on community feedback mechanisms and how they can be applied to impact investing more broadly, not just in the international development context. I'm very excited about that one. And we are going to be taking a deep dive into Islamic finance, likely in early April, and looking at the Islamic finance principles side by side with Transform Finance principles and other metrics and measurement around impact investing. And lastly, we have also a webinar where we're going to look at the foundation investment side of the house and how they can learn and teach the program side of the foundation. So stay tuned for updates on those webinars, and we'll be sending invites for those out shortly. Lastly, if anyone on the line or outside watching the recording have any topics that they'd want to hear discussed by the Investor Network, we'd be happy to hear those thoughts, and we can incorporate them into the webinars down the line. So today's topic, we're looking at a theme that we've looked at a few times before, specifically around energy transitions and just transition, how to make that energy transition more equitable and make sure that some of the harm that has been done with extractive industries are not recreated in the energy infrastructure. We had a webinar with Grupo Yansa and with their renewable projects in Oaxaca. Back in the day, we have written also a report that arose out of those conversations on the community impacts of renewable energy projects, specifically how investors can think about risk in that context and avoiding risk that comes from not engaging communities deeply and making sure that their needs are being addressed in building those energy projects. And recently we had a webinar on the just transition with Brunsting, And here we have a definition of the just transition from the ITUC paired with excerpt from the Paris Agreement. And you can see that this language is definitely making its rounds in the energy transition context. And today, we're going to hear from Aner and Navajo Power about this topic. And with that, I'm going to pass it along to Aner. Feel free to take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Kurt. Yeah, so I'm Aner Ben-Mi with Candide Group. We work with families and foundations and help them deploy capital towards investments with a strong commitment to social justice and community-centered approaches to impact. So we work with clients like the Libra Foundation or Pi Investments that are committed to applying these principles across their portfolio. And our investment focus is really broad, both in terms of investment sectors and strategies. We could just as well be pursuing a early stage Series A investment in a coding academy for underserved communities, one day, and a PRI style patient debt investment in a community-centered solar development, the next day. So when we, let's see if I have control over the slides. Yep. When we approach investments related to climate solutions, or resource efficiency, or clean energy, we really try to do this in applying this just transition lens, as that Kurt referenced as well. Meaning that in addition to the climate impacts that we look at, we also are considering, we're also looking for strategies that are predominantly benefiting marginalized communities. And we generally are always looking through this lens of who is benefiting from the transition or who's getting hurt or left behind. Yes, of course, the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy is urgent and is critical from a climate perspective. But like any major transition, it creates winners and losers, and we're sort of trying to focus on, making sure that that transition is more equitable and not perpetuating who those winners and losers are. So that means looking at, you can see on this slide, kind of the rough framework that we use. We're looking at who the customers are. So is it really only making solar accessible to homeowners in single-family homes with 680 FICO scores and above, or is it a more inclusive strategy that allows kind of broader-based participation on the customer side? We're also looking at where are jobs being created or where they're being lost, because there's been tremendous growth, job growth in the solar industry, but 65% of those solar jobs have been created in 10 states, and California alone accounts for about a third of those solar jobs. So thinking about where are those benefits going again. And finally, thinking about where the kind of project benefit flows. So as investors or as project owners have gotten, solar has been a very successful asset class for project investors as a whole. Who's that benefit accruing to, and our communities participating in that? At times, as we've seen with some of the case studies that have been covered here in previous webinars, the communities maybe not only did not participate in that upside or that benefit creation, they possibly have been hurt or displaced as part of these projects. So I think when you think about kind of community impact in the context of clean energy, it's easy to really focus on smaller community scale projects that really lend themselves to kind of direct community benefit and ownership. And I wanted to highlight here that we really kind of think about the full spectrum of projects, from small residential through community scale and up to these larger utility scale projects. We're kind of in all of the above investor from that perspective. They all matter. They're all a part of the general mix, and they all have various kind of social justice implications. So whereas kind of going left to right on this slide, whereas the residential systems have the benefit of being a really strong job creation engine because there's a lot of installers on people's rooftops and really empowering homeowners to take ownership of their energy. They're also very expensive. It's also very expensive power, and probably 3 or 4 times more expensive on a per watt basis than these larger projects. And then through these kind of community scale projects where, C&I commercial scale projects where I think the significance of those being really allowing companies to take leadership and self-generate clean power and decarbonize a very large swath of power consumption, the commercial and industrial power consumption. And on to community solar projects that are really exciting in terms of their potential to expand the reach of solar to customers that wouldn't qualify for traditional rooftop solar, like renters or low FICO score customers or people in multifamily homes. But though that's a sector that we're really excited about, a sector that's still relatively small and kind of upcoming. Less than this is a sort of a small fraction of the installed capacity. And then on the right hand side, utility scale project, which is what we're here to talk about today with Navajo Power. Again, much cheaper on a per installed watt basis, sort of sub-$1 per watt versus $3 to $4 per watt for the residential systems. These are the ones that are kind of really hitting grid parity and displacing fossil fuels in a very direct way. Not a huge job creator because these are much bigger projects and you're not kind of generating the economic activity. But this is where a lot of the megawatts are being built. And so if we want to think about kind of the just transition implications of clean energy, we can't kind of gloss over that segment and just kind of focus on the more community scale projects. So if you think about kind of the growth, if you follow the growth of clean energy at all, you'll often see these exciting charts about how the cost of clean power is beating out the cost of coal or natural gas in some cases, and how it's been dramatically decreasing over the years. You have to kind of remember when we look at these exciting growth charts and cost charts, they are referring to these larger projects, right? Again, we love and care about the community scale projects as well, but this inflection point around grid parity, that's when you hear about that, these are these 100 megawatt plus projects. And I wanted to highlight similarly, this is true for the U.S., which is what we're here really to discuss today, and the data above was really U.S. focused, but it's also true in the global South, right? So again, there's a lot of focus, and we've done work around smaller systems and mini grids, kind of last mile connections in the global South. But these larger systems, again, we tend to forget them as impact investors, and ultimately, again, if you think about it from a cost to the consumer, to the end customer perspective, central grid connections, could in some of these sub-Saharan African countries can come in at about 10 cents per kilowatt hour, compared to a solar home system on a remote home, which could end up at $5 per kilowatt hour, so 50 times higher. So again, sometimes that's there may not be the option for a central grid connection, but that should be a something that we strive for. And then again, and then there's the scale issue. We've been involved helping with a utility scale developer in sub-Saharan Africa, a company called Gigawatt Global. Some of the projects they're working on that are 100 megawatts and above, or a particular project in Nigeria that they're working on that's 130 megawatts. If you compare that just from a scale perspective, one such project is sort of equivalent to about 15 million solar home systems, like the ones that a company like Mcopa sells. So again, we're not knocking those home systems, but just highlighting that we can't ignore these larger infrastructure projects as well. And this map highlights an analysis of how various or which type of solution is most applicable or most suitable for various parts in the African continent in terms of access to power. And it's sort of an all of the above approach. You kind of need all of them, and we as investors, I think the message here is we as investors need to really care about these large and maybe less sexy infrastructure projects as well. And it's just a few examples of kind of how we've applied our lens, this kind of just transition lens across the spectrum from small to large projects. Again, on the residential side, we've in our portfolio there are companies like Solar Hauler that's really kind of pioneering a solar industry in West Virginia and helping create jobs for former coal workers, or a company like Posigen in Louisiana that has a really unique model selling into lower income households by being the only solar provider that doesn't require a credit check. And then kind of all the way to the right to these utility scale, really infrastructure developers. I already mentioned Gigawatt Global as a company that's active in sub-Saharan Africa, and I guess really implementing best practice processes in terms of community engagement and making sure that the communities are capturing as much value as possible from projects. And then Navajo Power would fit into that that bucket in the U.S. context. So wanted to set the conversation or frame the conversation a little bit for Dan and Brett here from Navajo Power around what are the specific impact challenges or considerations that we look at in these larger infrastructure projects. Again, sometimes as opposed to these smaller community scale projects. So a few recurring questions or issues that we see when we look at these sort of models. One is the question of land rights. So again, these are larger projects. They require a lot of land. 100 megawatt solar project requires about 1,000 acres of land. So how is that land selected? Whose land was it? How are they? How is land title treated? Who benefits from that transition? What are the alternative uses of that land? There's a lot of questions around land use and or abuse in some cases. Then there's a question of political power. So again, as opposed to some of the smaller projects, when you're working on one of these larger infrastructure projects, you're invariably working with the highest ranking kind of political powers in a local community, be it the president of a government in Africa, or in this case, be the president of the Navajo Nation, right? So you need that political support for the project to move forward, for land acquisition, for interconnection permits, and you just want to make sure that that support is needed, but you also want to make sure that it's not being acquired in any unethical way. Another big question I think we're going to be talking about here in this presentation is the constraints applied by capital markets here. Again, because these are really large projects that ultimately, at the construction phase, require tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars for construction, which means that you ultimately that capital has to come from large institutional investors. It will come from the BlackRocks or Goldman. It will come from large financial institutions that have they have their templates. They're looking for very clear kind of financial hurdles, and that can limit your ability to come up with a very innovative, inclusive structure in terms of community benefits. You have your hands slightly more tied than you might if you're working on a project that's a $5 million project, and you can fund it with impact investors, or you can sort of crowd, maybe the community can help finance it. That's not the case with these larger projects. And then there's also just the kind of practical consideration around the business model that, as a developer, Navajo Power or its peers would have to navigate. I mean, these are very lengthy development processes, and it can easily be a 3-year process, sometimes more, to get all the permits, to negotiate a PPA, to acquire the land. And throughout that multi-year process, the developers have no revenues, right? So there's overhead to just run, keep the shop running, and there's actual development costs around environmental studies and such. And so the business model ends up being a bit of a kind of feast or famine situation, where you might have zero revenues for 3, 4, or 5 years, and then a huge windfall if a really big project closes and the developer earns a fee at that stage. But there's a real question there in terms of how to finance that, right? Is it, how much of that can you finance with grants? How much of that can you finance with debt that then has to patiently wait to get repaid once the project closes? So these are recurring, I think, issues that Navajo Power or any utility scale developer would have to deal with. And I won't belabor this. I mean, these are, again, some of the specific questions that we ask, or when we look at such projects, and that we would like to kind of dig deeper with the Navajo Power team, and to understand around community engagement models, and really how the developer navigates the local kind of social political power structures, and making sure that again, you want to create benefit for the community, but you want to be sensitive to not creating kind of winners and losers within the community as a result of your project, and how you go about the process of selecting the right site for the project, and making sure that the benefit from that site flows to the appropriately and fairly and transparently to the right people. How you set up governance structures around the use of those community funds. In what ways do you involve the community in economic participation in the project? Is it primarily through land lease or royalty-based compensation, or is there an ownership stake in the project? Again, subject to some of those questions or constraints I mentioned on the previous slide, which is that you ultimately have to put together an ownership structure that is that you can go to a large institutional project investor with, and offer whatever 6, 7, 8% IRR they need to get, because that's how you're going to get the project funded. So it's a really rich conversation, and I want to say what's really interesting as an investor in having these conversations. We don't have the perfect template answer, right? We don't. Here's how you need to check all of these boxes, and you're good to go and you've hit the gold standard. It's a nuanced conversation. It's different in every local context. And what we look for is a developer that's that's really thoughtful in navigating these questions, and that it's surprising often how quickly you can sort of tell, even if you don't have all the answers, and the developer doesn't have all the answers, you can tell by just by kind of running through these questions, the extent to which the developer is really wrestling with these, right, and thinking about them deeply, and if they are, as we think that's the case with Navajo Power, then at least we know we have a partner with whom to navigate these decisions thoughtfully over time. We're not looking for definitive. Here's the model. It's simple and easy, but we're looking for somebody um, to have the right voices around the table, and to be, really kind of thoughtfully engaged around these questions. So with that, I think it's a good transition to Dan and Brett and the Navajo Power team to talk us through their model.
And we started down this path about 2 years ago, really to diversify the economy. And Brett and I and Dan, Josh, we pulled our team together, and we wanted to make a change. We wanted to do something where we build our community wealth. We allow Navajo communities to drive projects to build their capacity. And I think we've done a really good job up to now. And so it's an honor to meet all of you. I am Navajo. I was formerly the head of commerce for the Navajo Nation, also head of government development for the nation. I've done a lot of socially responsible entrepreneurship over the years. Thank you.
My name is Brett Isaac. I'm also a partner of Navajo Power, as well as a member of the Navajo Nation. I've been involved in a number of different facets of renewable energy out on Navajo, from off-grid and battery-based systems to community development empowerment. And part of the origin of Navajo Power kind of derives from our need to address energy as a whole on the Navajo Nation. We know that, it's been a coal community for a long time, and one of the things we're facing with the closure of the Navajo Generating Station and the scaling back of coal in general is a need for the Navajo Nation to replace and transition that to something a little bit more future-leaning, because we know the global markets and economics are starting to point that tech and energy itself is moving towards renewables. Navajo Power was created as a public benefit corporation. Kind of an example of a B Corp would be like Patagonia. It's a for-profit corporation with a social mission. And what our social mission is to maximize community benefits. So one of the things we wanted to do with energy was to kind of reshape it in a way that it impacts the areas in which these projects are built. The economics land as local as possible, and we can actually improve communities through the development of new energy projects. Right now, Navajo Power is focused on large-scale utility. One of the reasons for that is, the economics work for the Navajo Nation to be able to have, land that's accessible as well as affordable and economically feasible due to the coal assets that are currently in place and the transmission systems. So there's a lot of utilities and off-takers, as well as potential markets that could open up because of the geographical positioning of the Navajo Nation. The other thing is, as these coal assets become stranded, recreating value in these assets is going to require converting them to renewable energy that, states like California, which has a 100% renewable energy mandate, can actually take advantage of. The other thing is we can also utilize, some of the more pressing concerns around climate change, to start beginning this discussion about reutilizing land on the Navajo Nation. Growing up there my whole life, you can see a lot of the effects. The grasses are not growing as much. The ranchers are noticing, their livestock aren't yielding the things they used to in the past, and in some areas the water tables have kind of diminished to the point where, the land is not returning what it could return in those traditional, economies. So one of the things is putting the land back to work, for the Navajo people, so that it can yield a benefit for the communities and yield something that they can actually utilize, to build, to live, to put food on the table and to have jobs and security and sustainability. So one of the things we're looking at is we're kind of focusing on the 100 megawatt and above project, which would require about 1,000 acres at a time. Navajo Power has goals of doing gigawatts size systems, but we realize, that there is a sensitive nature behind development as it kind of pertains to indigenous communities and land. So part of like what the Navajo Power philosophy is we cannot be like the older forms of energy and forms of development. We got to be inclusive. We got to actually take responsibility to be responsible in developing. So not just forcing projects through communities, but instead building relationships and partnerships with them so that they feel as much a part of the process as we are. And we think that's going to be important because we want the energy market to feel beneficial, not a burden. And the old energy kind of philosophy, the paradigm, was very top down. You had the central government collecting revenues, resources, all those things, making high level decisions for the communities. But when revenues were returned back, they weren't making it back to the communities in an impactful way. You kind of have this upside down triangle with the central government being on top and communities at the bottom. Revenues, decision making, all those things eventually were a trickle by the time they reach communities. We want to do it the other way. We want to invert it and have a foundation of revenues being able to go to communities to kind of drive some of their more pressing priority projects, as well as, acknowledge why the land is available. And that's the ancestral connection between, the people we're working with, the Navajo people, their use of the land with ranching and farming, and why it's still available because they actually took care of it, and they have it for us to be able to potentially develop. The other thing is we want to have revenue streams that are guaranteed for communities, as far as like improving infrastructure, improving roads, improving just local economy. We think that, by providing that kind of a service, you improve more communities through, this type of activity. A bit of the history with energy on Navajo is that, the Navajo Nation was actually created because of energy. The need to sign leases and agreements with energy developers, from oil and gas companies to eventually coal companies. So the Navajo Nation has a rich history with energy, but it's not always been positive. There's been a lot of effects, with the abandonment of structures, the abandonment of mines, the abandonment of responsibility. So one of the things we have to do is rebuild the relationship with communities and energy so that they understand exactly what our intention is and that we're transparent in the activity. They can kind of get an assurity that we're not coming in, fronting another company or doing something that may be malicious in intent. We're actually trying to be as sensitive and as, appropriate as we possibly can. And that's what we believe will shift the decision making on the communities to be able to be more supportive instead of skeptical. And that's been a lot of our unique strategy, is that we're willing, because we're from these areas, because we speak the language, we understand the people and the needs, we want to be able to interpret, the economics of energy projects to local leadership and local, communities and people, so that they can feel why their, consent and commitments will benefit not just, their community, but provide energy to be exported across the Southwest. We want the Navajo Nation to continue to be, in a way, the Navajo Nation's been the battery for the Southwest, providing power, to Los Angeles, Las Vegas, sending power to bring water down to the valley in Phoenix and Tucson. Right now, that's kind of at a bit of a transition point, and we want the Navajo Nation to play a role continuing in the next version of energy, which for now is solar, renewable energy, but eventually to be able to learn the skill sets of development, so that we own the development as Navajo people and that we own the process. It's not just someone coming in doing it, but they feel acknowledged as we're moving along. Um, we try to focus these projects in a way that actually benefits, very visual. We have a project that leads to the potential ability to create a trust fund through lease revenues, which can be invested into economic development programs, which is the empowerment that Native families have been looking for. One of the things that we kind of talk a lot about with communities is economic sovereignty. Right now, a lot of their public services are kind of leveraged on political influence, whether it be the central government or the federal government, because a lot of the revenue streams they have are not generated by economics, but morely by, some of the things that they've had in the past. Creating new revenue streams is going to give them a little bit more of a decision-making power over what directions their communities can go and what they invest into. An example could be if they want to do off-grid solar. The Navajo Nation still has well over 15,000 homes that don't have electricity and running water. And one of the things we don't want to do is build these large projects and fail to acknowledge that deficiency. We want to actually contribute because the founders and partners in Navajo Power all come from various different parts of the renewable energy ecosystem, whether it's finance or, in my case, I build and construct and deploy off-grid units specifically for the Navajo area. The Navajo Nation is roughly the size of West Virginia. It's a large landscape. And so logistics and supply chain and all those things are very complex out there, but we feel that we can contribute back to figuring out solutions for those, as well as being able to address what Navajo people value the most, which is action. They want to see things. They don't just want talk and those things to be, what they kind of know about a company. Having the ability to actually solve problems that they have currently is part of our pitch to them. The other thing that this will also lead to is a bit of workforce development. The creation of jobs is a large concern with the closure of coal facilities because they employ so much. But rooftop solar, off-grid solar, those are very labor-intensive jobs. So the creation of that kind of an industry would lead to more workforce development.
Brett, do you want to talk a little bit about the Bennett Freeze and some of the communities we're working with there, and sort of just to give someone kind of the political context of and what the NES administration is focused on, just in that specific thing?
Yeah, so I come from the community of Shanto. My dad was from there. I pretty much grew up around the Black Mesa area my entire life. Now, one of the things you always realize is that utility service was a bit restricted. When the Navajo Hopi land dispute formed, it was basically the creation of the Hopi tribal boundary by the federal government created a dispute between the Navajo and Hopi tribe over where that line should exist. And an executive order was created, thus creating the Bennett Freeze area. What the Bennett Freeze is, it froze development, infrastructure improvement projects, financial investment, all those kind of things in a large area surrounding that disputed line. And what it did was it made both the Navajo Nation and Hopi tribe have to be in agreement that anything that was going to be built within this area, they had to agree. So it required both tribes to actually consent to projects. It wasn't lifted until the Obama administration lifted it in, I believe, 2009, 2010, around that area. So it was a period of about 50 years, I believe, that there was not a lot of development that was easily done. And through that time, you have people that are living in this area that didn't have access to infrastructure, didn't have access to finance for home construction. And so there's a large need on the western side of the Navajo Nation and the central part of the Navajo Nation around the Hopi tribal boundaries that just didn't have a chance to get infrastructure developed. So that deficiency is kind of one of the things that we're dealing with in talking with communities, because if we build these large, infrastructure projects or large solar generation facilities, their first question is, can I tap into that? Because I don't currently have power. We want to come up with examples of ways that we can solve those, and the current president, Jonathan Nez, is also from the community of Shanto. And one of the things he had kind of challenged, me in the past, because I worked with him in Shanto, was the creation of products that actually could solve, this electrification issue, but doing it in a way that, uses local labor and local support. Is that Tony?
No. But there's a question here, who actually owns the projects? And then there's another question, who is the local electric utility and are they supportive of these projects? There was another one around an elders council. Do you want to take the NTUA and I could take the ownership one, Brett?
Go ahead on the ownership one.
It's just around ownership. One of the, when we first started Navajo Power, about 18 months ago, when we first started working with communities, a lot of the kind of foundation world that we were talking to and other folks from the outside were very excited about this concept. Basically there's a beautiful narrative of going into communities that have been kind of, for lack of a better word, exploited by outside energy companies, and then in this next energy transition that they would own these projects. But one of the things that we learned early on from communities is that actually communities, the ownership idea, what was actually more important to them was this idea of maximizing the economic benefits. The other part of that piece that we got pushback from is when we looked hard at this is because of the way clean energy projects are structured in the United States, a big driver of the economics is the investment tax credit, which is from the federal government, which allows big companies to basically get a tax credit for investing and owning in projects, as well as the depreciation. And so being that tribes and the local chapters are government entities, they actually don't have any tax appetite. So what we have to do under the project is what's called a flip back structure, a lease back structure. So an outside entity like a D.E. Shaw or Berkshire Hathaway would own it for 7 years, and then it would flip to the community. Now, two things there. One is that adds a degree of complexity, so that would take away revenues from the project, and our mission is to maximize the benefits. So that might rule out this idea. And two, the operational complexity. These are very big projects, so they have to be FERC compliant. If they go down, they have to be up within 3 hours. And so it's a real interesting question of what does really owning an asset look like. We are in conversations with several chapters and also the Navajo Nation at large about ownership, not in the projects directly, but also in Navajo Power directly. So those are conversations that are being had right now where the actual company, the developer, would have ownership with the nation and with local chapters as well as the Navajo partners, obviously, that are the founders and a huge part of this. But I do think that ownership is complicated because of these tax structures and incentives, and if you're trying to maximize the benefits. And I'll give you an example too. Is one of the communities we're working with, there's a big developer that's owned by a utility in Florida. I'm not going to mention who, and their bid in the community was actually 4 times less economics to the community than we were offering. And so, like a 400% delta in economics. And so we're really stretching the numbers to figure out how to get as much money to the local communities. And that's both a mathematical question in terms of just like modeling it out, but it's also, as Tony, maybe Tony, you could talk a little bit about Local Governance Act. It's also a question of political structure because historically, all those agreements between an outside developer and the Navajo Nation would have to go through Window Rock, and we are really one of the key challenges that we face is how do we structure it so it's at the local level. Tony, do you want to talk about LGA and that kind of issue specifically?
Sure. A lot of the work that's going on now, and just for the audience's background, I created the LGA about 20 years ago. It was a project of mine in grad school. And the before LGA, all chapters on Navajo really were just resolution governments. They couldn't govern. They couldn't make laws. They couldn't collect revenue. There was no ability to tax, no ability to do bond finance. They just couldn't. They weren't allowed to have the tools to do anything. So with that passage, several chapters have started. There's a process called getting certified. To the point now where about half all Navajo chapters are certified. There's 110 chapters on Navajo. So that's 110 communities. But what hasn't happened is that the nation still holds on to the deal making. They still A lot of the deals are still done at the central government. A lot of the revenues, the nation has been really stingy with sharing those revenues and that wealth with the communities. So that's really a part of the missing ingredient for the communities has been they don't have the wherewithal. They don't have the organizations, the infrastructure, the money collecting and budgeting processes in place. And so that's exactly what we're bringing to the table.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tony.
Yeah.
And kind of adding on to that, you know, as far as what support systems we have, you know, the Navajo Nation has its own utility, a Navajo Nation enterprise called the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority. Right now, they're just a distribution utility. They don't really have any generation. They essentially wheel, you know, power. They are getting into the solar generation and solar development angle, but you know they have about a dozen products that they offer, and just like any utility, they're kind of leaning them all on each other. One of the things we kind of pitch when we talk to utilities and to them is we want to do this development very, very well. You know, we want to hyper focus on this particular segment of the industry as far as scale, generation, and battery storage, and we want to be able to do that because you know these communities have had attempts at energy development in the past, but we're having this weird kind of synergy occurring in the Southwest where the need for renewable energy is growing. The cost of energy is at a very competitive level across all forms of energy, and the need to build projects rather quickly is kind of, you know, ramping up due to states increasing the mandated portfolios that require renewable energy generation. So one of the things that we're working on is building not only support with the utilities, but also with all the, you know, potentially working out partnerships with other Navajo Nation enterprises that may be interested in this type of development. But one of the things is we're kind of a bit in a different place because of our previous experiences in working in Navajo communities. We're focusing on trying to be locally based, meaning, you know, although we talk with the central government, the president of the Navajo Nation, the division directors, the different central level, portions of the Navajo Nation, a lot of our agreements and our commitments are embedded with community leadership and local leadership, because that's what's kind of been the missing link in previous development is they didn't acknowledge, you know, the sheep herders and the ranchers that were utilizing the land, and thought that the Navajo Nation had the ability to just go in and take land and develop on it. You know, there's a much more harmonious process where you actually have to get local support in order to build your project. Otherwise, you'll face a lot of people, you know, that either don't support it or also maybe even don't support the company that's out there. So building relationships and managing those is definitely a key part of what we're trying to do. We're open to as many partnerships as we need to make as far as working with local utilities, working with other things that we can work on that may increase the odds of success, But one of the things is the Navajo Nation, is viewed a certain way by the external world. And we also have to translate back some of the things that are not common as far as investment structures, land acquisition processes, land statuses, and investability. So creating those mechanisms and interpreting them both to the people on the ground as well as the people that potentially may invest as well as take the power off of these projects is something we're really working to do, and we feel that we have a good strategy going with it, because a lot of utilities and developers that have come to the Navajo Nation to develop these in the past have gotten frustrated with the process. But it's just they looked at it through a different lens. They were trying to bring a model that works somewhere different. We're building this model on the Navajo Nation, and we're hoping that it actually can lead to a model that can work with Indigenous communities across the country, if not across the world. Because it kind of takes into a lot of account the historical things that happen with energy and Indigenous communities, and starts to address them through the discussion of ownership, the interpretation and transparency behind development, and then also making sure that the economics are competitive. They're not asking for special privileges, but they're competitive with other projects in the region. That's a big thing we want to do. Is utilities have to buy. We keep hearing least cost plus fit. That's where the market is right now. Market prices dictate what we can sell. So we have to do everything, all these other elements, but still remain market competitive. And I think that's something we're finding a lot of success in, is that we're able to kind of interpret those things back and forth. Yeah. So kind of some examples, like one of the communities that we're working with and working on is the community of Lachie. One of the reasons we're working there is the Navajo generating station is located in the area. Part of the strategy we have to keep in mind is a bit of the economics. We have to build these projects close to transmission access and as many offtake potentials as we can possibly do. One of the reasons we picked this community was that the Navajo generating station has a scheduled closure for December 22nd of 2019, so the end of this year. And a lot of the former owners as well as current operators, are trying to figure out ways to continue relationships with the Navajo Nation. And so we kind of figured that if we can get projects in communities that have these attributes, we can use them to, one, be economically competitive, but also to start to reutilize, the transmission systems that are located in these areas. We've worked through various different education sessions with the community. We worked with the permittees explaining the process, as well as explaining the Navajo Nation's process, because a lot of communities, even though they've lived on Navajo, are not used to seeing development like this occur, and they're not used to how land is acquired on the Navajo Nation, especially land the size we're looking at. So the projects we're looking at in Lachie have this, have all the factors we're looking for as far as what we need in order to make it more competitive. Dan, do you want to add something to that?
I was going to say, actually, it's an interesting thing. We were talking about this in the preparation for the call. I think, where does Navajo Power kind of fall in the funding world? We've heard from a lot of PRI investors that they're looking at more community scale and off-grid, smaller projects, and that these utility scale projects are too big. And we hear from a lot of the utility scale investors and pre-development capital sources that that projects on Navajo are kind of automatically going to the kill pile because it's complicated. There's different issues. There's all these. That people have tried it and have come back unsuccessfully. And so it's an interesting thing from kind of an investment perspective. Where do we land? We've been successful to date at raising a good amount of PRI money, also grant money. But many of the traditional PRI folks that lend in Indigenous communities look at this project and they say, this is a huge infrastructure project, how does this fit into our kind of portfolio of doing, smaller scale community projects? So it's an interesting sort of tension that we have, which is both that we're doing these big, 100 megawatt, 500 megawatt, gigawatt projects, and at the same time, we're also very focused on things that are these tangible benefits and equity for the community. So we're sort of in a little bit, in some ways, in the kind of the funder world, in no man's land. But I would say maybe it's also a new model that has yet to been developed that I think could change the way clean energy is developed and the way that we look at clean energy development. And I think that Navajo Power, although maybe we still need a couple of turns on our kind of thinking and the model, I think it's getting there as we get closer to landing these projects. It's happening. I do think that we're onto something in terms of a new model of utility scale development where the economics are really focused on the local communities around the projects. Let me look at my, the other thing I want to talk about is, when we talk about economic transition, there's a lot of kind of snake oil solar companies that come out to the res and say that, we're going to replace all of the jobs for coal and, we're going to employ all these people. And although the construction period is a kind of a rich period of job creation, we're looking at a gigawatt, we have about 200 to 300 jobs in that initial couple-year period. One of the challenges with solar is that for the Navajo Nation, which is different than these big coal facilities, is a gigawatt of solar employs about 10 people. And actually, we're looking at even eating away at that because we're looking at using sheep grazing. The main function of the operations and maintenance is to cut the grass and wash the panels, and so we're actually looking at utilizing sheep for that, so people can still graze in some of these areas. Not everywhere, but in some of the communities. So that's another challenge, and that's sort of how we arrived at this model, which is it's not about necessarily job creation and kind of a quid pro quo. I'm going to look at these questions in just a second. It's actually more about how you create economic diversification from the revenue streams of these projects. So Gay, curious as to why you decided not to go down the cooperative ownership route too. Can you have an SPV that is an LLC for the taxpayer, then flip cooperative ownership? Yes, that is something that we can do. As I said, I think it adds a degree of complexity. And anytime in these kind of transactions that you add complexity, you're adding legal costs and accounting costs and all that kind of stuff. But I do think it's possible, and it's also something that we're looking at. And so we are looking at that. Cooperative ownership is an interesting idea for an asset that ultimately there's not many. It's not like there's any decision making with the solar project. It just the sun shines and revenues are produced. So it's not like there's like a real seat at the table. It's really about ownership. And at the end of the day, again, what we're trying to do is maximize the economic benefits. So if it is determined that ownership of the asset is the best way to create economic prosperity at a local level, we will do that. Okay, I'm looking at Christina. Can you talk about what things utility scale funders would need to become aware of able to fund this kind of project that has community buy-in? And also, can you talk about the land acquisition process? What does ownership look like and decision making? So, Brett, maybe I'll let you and Tony talk about the land acquisition project process. In terms of the utility scale funders, I think ultimately they will get around to this once we get a power purchase agreement signed, which is something we're working on as we speak. Fundamentally, I think that is the big de-risking for utility scale investors is seeing offtake, because then you have a big company with contractually obligated revenues for a very long period of time. And so I don't think they actually, I'll actually say this, I'll say it more proactively. I think they care about two things. One, they care about having the best, as Brett was saying, best cost, best fit, least cost. So they care about cheap electricity source and a reliable electricity source. So we check that box because we're very, we're very competitive on the electricity prices. It's in the low 20s, in terms of a megawatt hour. But in terms of community benefits, I would actually say that it's a real benefit to the utilities to have what we're doing, because a lot of the utilities on Navajo, I'll give an example, SRP, they signed a lease extension for Navajo Generating Station and lost about $40 million on that lease extension. Why did they do that? They wanted to give the nation 2 years of time to plan the economic transition. I would argue that was completely botched by the previous president. He didn't win the election. He was, very unpopular in many ways. And I think he really, used the opportunity of a lease extension, actually figuring something out to do sort of political grandstanding around keeping the plant open. But there's no buyers for the power, and so how are you going to keep the plant open? I think we need to look at, Brett and I kind of use the ranching metaphor. There's a sick horse, and sometimes you just gotta, put it to rest. And that's sort of our view with these plants, is like no one's willing to have the honest conversation about it because it's a very politically tricky situation. But ultimately, these plants are going to shut down. There's zero doubt in my mind, because every state around Arizona has basically agreed to not buying coal. And then the buyers in Arizona are transitioning to natural gas and solar. So there's no market. And so that lease extension period was kind of botched. And we're hoping that we have a softer landing with these projects to be able to say, this is the future, this is what we're transitioning to, and here's how we're thinking about it. But yeah, I don't know, Tony, you're gonna say something? Tony?
No.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Well, I can speak to the land acquisition process. So, I've been doing community development work on the Navajo Nation for the better part of a decade. And in one of the communities I work with is Shanta. One of the things we really kind of try to do is become really innovative with how we look at land value creation. One of the things is the bulk of the Navajo Nation is under trust status with the federal government, meaning the land is held in federal trust, and the Navajo Nation, can issue leases or, essentially grant rights to access and rights to use. Majority of the Navajo Nation is in what they would call grazing status, meaning that if it's not being used for another purpose, individuals of the Navajo Nation can obtain a grazing permit and be able to use it to ranch, to have their animals graze on this area. And there's particular parameters around that. But one of the things that's acknowledged is that the grazing issuance, so that the amount of grazing permits issued is actually greater than the land yield can actually support. So you have an oversubscription of animals grazing on land, leading to, a lot of ecological problems. But one of the things that we have to do is, when we pick an area, we have to work with the local land users. And there's a thing, kind of similar to what you call squatters' rights, but it's customary use. So you have ancestral families that have utilized land, whether it be for ranching, farming, or sometimes it's even just for their own recreational use. They hike back there, they collect plants and herbs, they have a very unique relationship with the land. And we once did a very detailed exercise with a lot of the ranchers and local land users and permittees, and asked them to kind of list all the words that came to mind when they thought about land. In that conversation, one word never came up, which was money. So the land doesn't have a dollar per acre value as it does in other parts of the world. What it has is it has some ancestral uses and some ancestral values that make it, unique to developing projects in this area. Meaning getting on that wavelength is something we have to actually do in order to be successful developers, is understand why it's of value to them and how we can be, one, sensitive to their valuation, but also interpret it in a way that, we can provide benefits to the permittees and to the community that equate to that value, meaning we're not taking it and utilizing it and leaving them with nothing, but we're bringing assets. And what they ask for is like money's usually not really a thing. Typically it's like we want access to water. We want access to, improved roads. We want these things that are going to improve their daily lives. It's not necessarily a dollar figure they can really come up with. So we've had to do a lot of internal strategizing and valuation on how we prepare offers and agreements to permittees, to communities. And then we also have to take this, and even though the Navajo Nation is here and they're a government and been around forever, we have to interpret what we did there back to them and why we created the value system we created. Because it definitely takes a little bit of existential thinking, getting outside of the normal development model of I'll give you X number of dollars for this many acres. It's about trying to be, in sync with how they value these projects and what they're going to return back to these communities. That's what their biggest concern is. But once we have those agreements kind of agreed upon, we have a community that votes to support the redesignation. So land has to be taken from grazing status and redesignated for commercial operation. In our case, the operation of a solar and battery facility. Once it gets to that, it kind of goes through a traditional aspect with the nation doing, realty checks and, land surveys, all those kind of things. And then we go into a formal leasing process. The Navajo Nation works a little different, and before you can operate and disturb the land, you have to get a lease. And in the case of our projects, that means we have to do our environmental, biological, cultural, and any other necessary studies before we can actually begin, construction or any form of disturbance of the land. And we've taken a pretty strategic approach to how we go through these different stages of land acquisition and development. And we think that, or no, we don't think, we know that, the communities have been very respondent to the way we've interacted with them. Navajo Nation from the Central really appreciates us not just going in and trying to strong arm people and maneuver and politically pressure, but instead work in areas that we're very sensitive. If it's a hard no, it's a hard no. We move on to another area. It's not a forceful type of development, and it's not a, take it or leave it thing. There's a lot of interaction we have to have in order to make these projects successful, and that's what we're doing.
Just a quick note on funding. Anair asked me, so I'm sort of fielding these questions that I think would otherwise be facilitated with Anair's voice. So just want to talk a little bit more about finance and some of the kind of how we look at it. So kind of backing up a second, there's Navajo Power as a public benefit corporation, and then we have two SPVs that we have formed. One is called Shondine LLC, and the other is Sheep Herder Solar One, and these are for a couple of different assets, communities across the nation. And so when we're talking about finance for Navajo Power, we're talking about both at the corporate level. So like to give you an idea, like we're talking over the next 3 years, the corporate budget, overhead and travel and all the, everything going to like the team is around $5 million over 3 years. But each project entity, which we're also fundraising for, is about per gigawatt, we're looking at a budget of roughly $8 million. We're hoping we can go significantly under that, but to be conservative, it's around $8 million. And that will get paid back once the project is funded by the tax equity or sold or in some sort of financing event. So there's sort of project level debt, and then which is like pre-development capital, and then there's also the corporate overhead. And then, and those things are somewhat blurred too, because we will use corporate overhead for project development costs if we can't raise money for the project level. And it's just much more expensive capital, obviously, because it's equity. But that's also a possibility, that we use our own balance sheet to fund things like the environmental impact statements and other permitting costs associated with a project. Let me look at the. You want to clarify, Crystal, to know about any challenges you were facing in the ownership side? I was talking about that. Maybe can you just clarify what you mean? I was trying to touch upon some of the economic issues. Would love to understand better what you're saying there. Nancy, it's a great question around the social impact metrics we're using as Navajo Power, whether they're Navajo cultural values or they're standard social impact measures. One of the things that we are in the process of doing is establishing that. And I don't know, Tony and Brett, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the kind of, we are working on our own kind of measurement of impact and how we think about that, things like sovereignty and community leadership as sort of part of that. I don't know, Tony or Brett.
Yeah. I can add to that. The way we work with traditional peoples is very unique, and that goes to our mission, which is that we wanted to help elders and traditional peoples that have never been included on projects like this, to educate them, to make them comfortable with the project, to look at land and to look at places that, maybe has certain types of ties to their community, to their family. Even though we don't have land ownership by a Western sense, we have a traditional identity that's tied to land. And in the Navajo way, when a baby's born, the umbilical cord is buried where you want your child to always long to be. And many of these families, they always say, like, our kids and our grandkids, great grandparents, everybody's umbilical cords are buried here, and so we have to really respect those processes, and that's exactly how we go about it. Is we really work closely with the elders. We identify certain plants. We do a lot of what's called cultural mapping, which is learning the stories, learning the different uses, the traditional uses, where the ceremonies are held, where different types of, we have big social gatherings, social ceremonies, where those are held, what are the different plant types, where's the land possibly overgrazed, where's areas where that they could use some rest for like 30 years. And so we really go through and we learn a lot ourselves. And I think the elders, they have an ownership stake now. They become excited, and they feel like they have ownership in the project. So that's really something that's unique. But the same thing with the community. A lot of the communities, and I know Janine asked this earlier. This is really hard because the communities don't have the mechanism. It's like, who makes a decision to take in revenue for the community when you start talking numbers that will start helping diversify the economy? A couple of million coming into the chapter is a big deal, but where do you put that money? And then how do you make sure it's done, it's managed with accountability? How do you make it where it's invested in diversification into the right things? So those are some of the things that we have to really pave new ground for. We're helping, like Lichi, develop a community development corporation. We're really doing some leading thinking. We're putting together some workshops around that subject. The other area that I know Brett, Dan, and others we've been discussing is we're creating really new wealth, as Dan was talking about, and Brett, a lot of these traditional permittees, they're not interested in money for themselves. They want to see the community progress. They want to see new water lines. They want to see scholarships for the children, different types of help for the elders. And so it's like really doing some of that thinking and figuring out how to reinvest some of that new wealth into community wherewithal and community progress. So that's really where we're kind of building a whole new paradigm in these communities, and this kind of stuff has never happened before.
Yeah, and to kind of add on to Tony's thing, part of this has been trying to rapidly interpret feedback we get in interacting with communities as to how this development occurs. We have a lot of work that we centered around engagement and appropriateness, and making sure that when we're focusing our strategy, that one takes into mind what are some of the deficiencies that communities have always seen in energy development, and addressing like local impact and community impact is one of the bigger things, but also like how they can feel that like the process isn't taking advantage of people or situations, and I think that's a really bigger discussion that we're having, is like, how do we interpret this in a way that one creates value, so that it's a process that can be replicated and reutilized, but also that it's interpretable to our investment, to the people, as to the reasonings why we need to take these unique steps in working with communities. Is that we'd like to kind of put together a model that actually is replicable and has those kind of things going forward. But one of my principles is like the thing though is we have to keep things as simple as we possibly can, because the more complex and the more it becomes really intricate in detail, the harder it is to actually convince people to take risks and chances. So one of the things we have to do is, as we're coming up with strategies and solutions, is to make sure that we have ways of actually, interpreting what the design and mechanism is to any other form of advisor or investor or operator or even impacted landowner, so that they understand like it's not a shell game. We're not trying to create something and move it around. We're actually just adapting the model to be more appropriate and resemble what the community wants to see in the project origins. Trying to look at questions. Dan, are you back?
Yeah. So, can you say a couple words about the PRI and foundation funds raised, how those investments are structured? And then also the email copies of the slides, and then are any of your sites on opportunity zones? Thanks, Anne. So we've had 2 PRI investors. The first one was the Grow Foundation, and those investments are structured as sort of very low interest, like 1% debt over a few-year period, and actually with a delayed interest payment, because we're expecting that we get our first kind of revenue event in 2021 or so, when we sell the project, and so that is really helpful in terms of the structure, in terms of deferred interest. Happy to send you the copy of the slides. And are any of your sites on opportunity zones? Yes, we do have opportunity zones. We're looking into that, and how that could work. So I'm just looking at some of these other questions. So Zoe, this is a good question. One of the big gaps that we see is in workforce development. To our knowledge, most, and this is again limited knowledge because this is not our expertise, but the most scaled up version of workforce development for solar is Solar Ready Vets, which has trained like 200 or 300 people in solar for veterans who are moving into the solar industry. I think it's around that. That's maybe what it was a few years ago. And don't quote me on those numbers because I think that's what it was a year or so ago. And then also with the Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation, and the founder of that, Nick Tilson, is a partner at Navajo Power and is a real thought leader in the space. But you know, as folks are kind of talking about the Green New Deal and this sort of guaranteed job, kind of on the ground, honestly, operationally, it's very difficult to imagine doing that at scale. I mean, we go into these communities and we're working around all the coal-fired power plants on Navajo, and you know, it's the skill sets are not necessarily transferable, even though they're both people work in power. You know, like the chapter president of Lachee, Jerry Williams, he's been working at the NGS for Navajo Generating Station for 40 years, and he's championing the solar project. He, for many years, was a welder, which is a very useful skill for solar in many ways. For utility scale, probably not actually so useful. And then he does logistics now, which actually could be useful and transferable. But it's sort of a question to us: how do we actually do that at scale? And that's it's almost like a second company. So one question we have is who is like the right groups to work with, and we actually had SRP and a few of the other utilities make introductions to the Department of Labor in Arizona and kind of got radio silence from them, unfortunately. And so we're kind of trying to figure out that piece, and we're in conversations also with the Navajo Nation Department of Labor too. Opportunity zones. The answer is yes. Again, we're looking at that now. These areas, some of them have been certified as opportunity zones. And you can contact Navajo Power. We can. I'll make sure. I'll just ask Anair and Andrea if they can send around our contact information, or you can go to navajopower.com, or you can email us. So it's all of our first. Oh, yeah, there's a contact slide towards the end. Okay, good. Okay. I'm just trying to see if there's other questions that we have. So Crystal, back to the ownership question. Again, we are exploring this and are really open. And this was our kind of original idea. The two areas of friction that we're seeing is one is on the structured finance side in terms of the document sets. These deals. This is a $700+ million deal. The legal fees associated with it are pretty extensive, and so adding complexity is going to add legal fees. And so that's one area. So like plain vanilla, at least for our first project or two, is sort of our preferred path because we just want to get something done, do it really well, and then we can add degrees of complexity. The other one is ownership. Again, we got pushback from at least two of the communities on this point because associated with ownership is just a lot of complexity in terms of management. And in the end, they would be outsourcing the operations and maintenance to a group like First Solar, et cetera, because they would have to be FERC compliant. And so it's not abundantly clear what the benefits of ownership are, other than the community has access to an asset and also will have a lot of debt encumbered on the asset. So we're working through that. Based on kind of my, I'm a product person. I try to think about what is the actual problem we're solving, and also like kind of a human-centered design process, like around the needs of these people and communities. And it's not been shouted at me from in their thousands of hours you spend in these communities that we want to own it. And that's the most important thing. There's other things that are, when you ask them what they want roads, they want water, they want access to power, they want jobs. Some of that might be translated into ownership, but I think it might be a bit of an abstraction and honestly a bit of an imposition of impact investment values on these communities, because at the end of the day, I think they really want economic benefits, but they're not like saying, hey, we want ownership. But at the same time, in some of the communities, there are people that have expressed that, and that's super cool. And we're really excited about these alternative ownership ideas. And if it doesn't eat into the revenues that would be going towards things like off-grid home solar or roads or other infrastructure projects, we're really open to it. And we're in conversations. One of the tax equity partners we're in conversations with, and they've done it, and they said it's less expensive than it is now, or than it used to be. So we're very open to that. Just looking at, so let's see. Thanks, Mark. That's kind of you. That's probably a question for Andrea. Let me just see if I have any. Yes, yeah, that's right, Delilah. That is a good point. I'll just say this about that though, and again, I'm not like a wealth advisor for these communities. I mean, in some ways, we are kind of playing that role, ownership also is risk, right? And so they're going to own this huge asset, and the power markets are a complicated set of regulations, political forces, economic forces, etc. I don't think the communities that we are working with have the ability to assess if that is a risk that they take on, like i.e., will, for instance, SRP or the utilities in Phoenix be around in 20 years to be buying power? I just think that, in my view, the person, one of my fears is that we do these leverage flip structures from, let's say, like, D.E. Shaw or Wells Fargo, and they use it as a way to sort of transfer the risk onto the community. So they harbor their tax benefits, they harbor their revenues, and they pass on to the community, and then, whoops, Phoenix runs out of water. I'm just saying that could happen. It actually is probably going to happen in the next 10 to 20 years. And so, how does a community assess that risk? Do they have access to these models, insurance products? And so, if you don't have any assets as a community, if you're a poor community, and your one asset is owning this $700 million project with debt that has bonds and things like that, and then something happens in the power markets where SRP goes out of business, it's actually pretty relevant. PG&E is probably not going to be able to fulfill its obligations on its PPAs. That's happening right now in California. I don't think that many of these communities, and I would say the Navajo Nation at large, and I would say most people on this call do not know how to underwrite utility offtake risk. I just think it would be fundamentally, and I'm sorry if this sounds crass, but it would be like forcing ownership onto a community that doesn't understand the risk that they would be obligating themselves to. So if they can bring on like an investment banker or someone that does do that where the alignment of incentives is clear and straightforward, and they really understand with their eyes open what they're getting into, I think we're all for it. I just think, again, it's kind of an imposition of like these kind of impact values that people in this type of community really feel, and I get why it's a very compelling story, but I think when you get into the details of it, you might be putting communities, subjugating them to a lot of risk that they might otherwise just want, like, hey, we just want our lease payments. That's it. And we want to be able to put that to water projects and off-grid solar projects and small business loans. And that's all we want, is just to get paid every year. And so that's sort of what we're hearing. And I will, we're kind of tracking it. Again, our mission as Navajo Power is to maximize economic benefits. So if it does, in some ways, help us achieve that mission, we're going to do it. But if it doesn't, we're not going to do it. I hope that was helpful. Yeah, I mean, I met with the lawyers for Deutsche Bank yesterday, who are also our lawyers, who are dealing with the PG&E bankruptcy, and it's it's a complicated debacle. I mean, it's who knows how that thing is going to turn out. And I'm not confident that that's not going to happen. I'm confident that that will happen again to other utilities in the next few years. And I'm confident that it's very hard to determine what's going to happen 20 years from now. I don't even know what I'm going to be doing in 3 months from now. So 20 years is a tough thing to understand in the future.
Hey, Dan, I wanted to respond to Delilah's point there about the capacity of communities to be investors themselves. I mean, we're really bringing new wealth to the communities and to the land permittees. And I know some of them have an interest, but they don't have the dollars to be risking. I mean, what we're doing is really high risk project development work. But down the road, with the new wealth that's created from these projects, there's a lot of different types of even other communities where we can do solar projects. There's other tribal communities, other places that we want to work in. I think these communities, and some of them have expressed that they'd like to explore being our partner in the long run. So I agree with your point, and that bringing in new wealth, building we're going to do this workshop on community development corporations and just how communities can develop an entity that works for them, that's truly accountable, that really can represent and engage the dreams of the community, and just how it would work. And really that's some of the things that are new tools that we're bringing to the communities.
Yeah, and I think to add on to me and Tony's comments about ownership, one of the things I do is, this is me talking as just as Navajo, as a member in a there's discussions right now about the Navajo Nation potentially buying the Navajo generating station and associated Kayenta mine that's currently run by Peabody Energy. And it strikes a fear in me because, the decision to own is really a great thing, but it also comes with the complexity of knowing what you're investing in and having, a role in being experienced and savvy enough. The Navajo Nation has been burned a lot of times before in investing in things from shoe companies to egg harvesting facilities to telecommunications, and right now their enterprises don't really have the best track record. And one of the things I've expressed to the leadership at the highest level of the Navajo Nation is that is the public ownership really the best place to put something? We've even talked about the Navajo Nation owning a bank, but is the public space a place for that, or should there be a foundation created for entrepreneurship and individual risk and individual wealth to play a role in creating a stronger economy? Traditionally, governances and public places usually benefit off of taxation, leases, regulatory, collection. They don't usually drive businesses, and when they do, they put themselves at extreme risk to instability and political interference. One of the things we want to create is ownership, one of the process, just that we do it internally. I myself, personally want to see this thing through because I want to prove that you don't have to be, from a place of establishment in order to get these projects done. You just have to know what the environment and ecosystem is on the Navajo Nation in order to conduct business. Owning that process means that we actually will be able to influence and create models that ensure, whether it's water, energy, commercial development, whatever it is, that we know how to get from conception to actual operation. And that's something we're still configuring even in this energy process. For the vast amount of resources the Navajo Nation has, it hasn't developed a large energy project in a long time. And we got to prove the concept. We got to take a step and have entrepreneurship take that risk initially. But I think there can be some eventual de-risking that allows for the investment and ownership to be able to benefit. the communities, the governments, the public entities at large. But, we still have to prove the concept works first before we start spending the money they could earn from that. So there's a lot of not only dream building we have to, maintain, but also responsibility to ensure that we're not just getting hopes up for the purpose of getting them up, that we're giving them real feedback so that they know their energy and expense is going to go to something of actual certainty, not just something we're kind of posing because it's something that's
We're coming up to an end here. Thank you. We'd love to do another follow-up, and we'd love to continue the conversations on ownership and feedback there, and dig in to these kind of questions that we're wrestling with at Navajo Power. We're not presenting a fully polished, finished model where the cooking is happening, and we welcome other sous chefs and cooks to the table. So we'd love to have your thoughts, and so really appreciate the feedback. I think sending so Delilah and Zoe, we'd love to look at some of these models that you're speaking about in terms of these kind of co-op structures or other types of community-driven ownership attributes that we could be looking at. So that would be super helpful to look at. I think that wraps it up. Tony, Brett, do you have any final thoughts?
Ian, thank you guys for taking the time. It's a very dense subject and a lot of information, but we're trying to build something transformative for our communities and the Southwest in general. And we want the Navajo Nation to play a large part in the transition that's occurring globally. So we're very thankful that people even pay attention to what we're doing and have an interest. Very thankful for that.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
So if you want to learn more about this, we could do a follow-up webinar and folks can get in touch with Transform Finance if they want to continue this conversation. Thank you for your time, everyone. We look forward to hearing from all of you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.